Welcome to the Leadership Gambit podcast, where we share life lessons to guide you through your journey to survive and thrive in a volatile business world. And now, Chris Miller.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Or welcome if it's your first time listening as well. This season, we've really tried to focus on tackling many of the biggest challenges and most commonly requested areas people ask for guidance in. Today, I want to continue that by talking about something that most people actively avoid, even when it's detrimental to their health, and that is conflict. Well, conflict management specifically. I would like everyone listening to ask themselves a couple of questions right now, and be honest with yourself. It's just you and I here. No one else can hear what you think or what you say if you're alone listening to this. There are no right and wrong answers, and there are no judgments. Okay, I want to be clear on that. Whatever the first answer that comes to your mind is. Now, I'm going to ask in generalities, recognizing that specific situations may deviate from your standard operating behaviors. In general, when you have or are in an unresolved conflict with someone, do you avoid dealing with the conflict or just jump right into working through it? In general, when something you want to say will potentially cause conflict, do you say that thing or keep quiet? Can you think of a time where conflict led to something good or positive as an outcome? What we're assessing here is whether you're someone who is generally conflict averse. If you are, take solace in the fact that the majority of people are conflict averse, so it's not surprising. Now, I do have a couple of more questions for you as well that I'd like you to ask yourself again, okay? When you know that you have an unresolved conflict with someone, does it make you feel awkward around them until it's resolved? When you have unresolved conflict with someone, does the idea of being around them cause you anxiety as long as it's unresolved? Have you had a situation where you dealt with a conflict only to realize that it was nowhere near as bad as you had made it out to be in your head? I assume many of you listening right now are likely nodding or saying yes to yourself, thinking yes, saying it out loud, whatever. No judgments, like I said. This second set of questions was really trying to assess for yourself how conflict makes you feel. Now, even for the small percentage of people who are not conflict averse, the idea of having conflict is typically not a good feeling. I am not someone who is conflict averse when I have to be. But conflict doesn't feel good. And I want to be clear, as we talk about conflict management and some, different approaches to it and things like that, this isn't about making conflict feel good because it never will in the moment. What I prefer we focus on for you today is being able to analyze and identify the common sources of conflict that you're going to encounter at work, and provide some tips on how to manage that conflict to give you confidence to deal with it head on. Now let's talk a little bit about why people are so conflict averse and some of the negative outcomes it can actually lead to if you let it fester. So there are a number of forces that drive us to be conflict averse. One of those is actually anthropological. The human animal, you and I, we're social creatures by nature. And for most of history, being accepted by the group was crucial for survival, and being shunned could literally have meant death. As a result, we have a biological aversion to conflict. Now, this is still observed in places like Japan, where social harmony is practiced over debating opinions. Incredibly focused on social harmony there still, which has a lot of good too, to be clear. But, there also happens to be some, repression as well. We've also talked about how biologically our brains do not like uncertainty, and there is uncertainty in how people are going to react to any sort of conflict. So just thinking about that and all of the uncertainty and the what ifs triggers stress hormone in us when we do. We're also conditioned at a young age not to argue, and that disagreement, and a lot of cultures, especially with people older or with higher status, that you just don't do that, right? It's disrespectful in a lot of cultures. Our brain's ability to go into all the different what ifs, and a lot of those what ifs to be like extremes, is quite common. And a lot of people often assume the worst case scenario is what's going to happen when there's nothing else to go on. Total uncertainty. Now, some personalities are also just more naturally conflict averse or sensitive to interpersonal tensions. Let's be honest, recognizing there are perfectly good reasons to avoid conflict, the world has greatly changed, even though our biology really hasn't. What has changed is our understanding of how our behaviors help or harm us at a physiological and mental level. How does avoiding conflict over time hurt us? What we've seen in studies is that it affects people in a number of ways. It builds resentment over time, and that's a result of suppressing your own needs. That resentment can turn into outright anger, hatred, anxiety, that kind of thing over time. It can damage your self-esteem when it means that you don't stand up for yourself. It can lead to missed opportunities because you avoid difficult conversations. It can lead to dysfunctional behavior when people are not rightfully challenged in the environment. And it can lead to burnout and physical health issues when your problems don't just go away on their own and they just keep dragging on and you keep just being stuck in that persistent stress and anxiety zone for not dealing with some of these things. Now, hopefully it's clear at this point that avoiding conflict outright and all the time is bad for you for many reasons. What that means is that your real skill shouldn't be avoiding conflict. It should be learning how to face it skillfully, empathetically, and assertively. So how do you go from avoiding conflict to facing it? Well, the first step for me is to identify the root cause of it. Now, before we jump in directly to common causes of conflict at work, let's start with a few general best practice tips on how you can confidently manage conflict. These are all things that I have practiced over time and I've seen very good results from. So one is get comfortable with conflict. Some of the best solutions that I have seen come together for things were actually born out of constructive conflict. I remember sitting in boardrooms, and days, evenings, and weekends arguing over certain things. And, by the end of the week, despite all the arguments, you've got a much better solution that any of you came into the room with individually at the start. So you need to recognize that not all conflict is bad. And some can actually lead to a better understanding of the larger picture at play. Another general tip, separate emotions from outcomes. Ask yourself whether struggles with someone actually are having a tangible negative impact, or is it just a feeling that you're projecting with no real evidence? Because I've seen a lot of that. Don't make it personal. You don't want to make conflict about the personalities or the behaviors. You want to make it about the results, the outcomes, and the impacts if you actually want to manage conflict to a resolution. I can't stress this one enough. Never go in guns blazing. It will diminish your brand and create an even greater conflict with the person you are aiming your guns at. If you need to leverage a little public humiliation, there are much more subtle and effective ways that we'll talk about in a future episode. Now, I need to double down on this one. Especially don't go in guns blazing when you haven't done your homework or your nose isn't clean. I have done it more than once. It has blown up in my face more than once. And that is why I stopped doing it. And I will say, after the second time, the third time, it's not the team's fault anymore. Now it's yours. It's not the other person's fault. It's yours. You've been burnt multiple times and keep going back for more. And just a quick story on that. When I was in my first management consulting role, I received word from one of the teams that was on site that the area wasn't ready for them to go and do their work in. They were building out infrastructure, cabling, and things like that. So I went down to the construction manager's office and I just started blasting him, telling him that I had my team mobilized. Your team said that everything would be ready for us. It wasn't. This is BS. He gets up. He says, "Give me a minute." Goes out of the room. comes back about 2 minutes later with a tablet, pulls up the tablet, and starts flipping through pictures showing the area has been complete. Needless to say, my team had lied to me. And they were, it was some other thing that they were dealing with that was the reason that they didn't want to be in that area working, but they had lied to me and told me it was because the area wasn't ready. So needless to say, I went back and gave them an earful, but my lesson there was do not go off half-cocked. Go and do your homework. Make sure that you are actually checking things for yourself before you just go in guns blazing. There are a lot of different reasons for conflict, too many to cover in a single session. So since we are talking specifically about some of the main types of conflict that you will experience at work today, let's discuss the top 3 sources of conflict at the office and provide some guidance on how best to manage them. To keep it simple, many conflicts come down to one of 3 things: different personal styles, different agendas, and different perceptions. Each of them has a different underlying reason driving the conflict and some nuance on how best to resolve that source. Well, let's start with the different personal styles. Differences in personal styles occur because we all vary widely in how we prioritize values, communicate, make decisions, resolve disagreements, handle structure, express ourselves. Maybe you're more shy and reserved, and I'm more direct and aggressive. Maybe I make decisions from the gut, but you need a lot more data and evidence to make yours. Maybe I confront people openly while you actively avoid confrontation, or, maybe you're highly structured and I don't want any structure and lots of flexibility. Additionally, differences in how we express ourselves and our core values can cause misunderstandings, tension, and frustration, even when we have similar goals. I'm sure you can see how these differences can lead to conflict. So, how do you best navigate this type of conflict? Well, because this is about personal style, this one has a risk of becoming or feeling like a personal attack. Remember, though, making it personal will trigger someone into an immediate fight or flight brain, the sympathetic nervous system triggers. As soon as that happens, you can no longer have a real meaningful discussion and conflict resolution. So my advice, don't start with the behavior to get to the conflict. Start from the conflict and then work backwards to get to the behavior. Now, what that means is the difference between going in and saying, your bad behavior caused that conflict, and, hey, that conflict earlier, let's dig into how and why that happened. The first one feels like you're attacking someone's character or behavior, where the second one isn't even an attack at all. Another tip is to find common ground or shared goals. When you reframe the discussion around achieving shared goals, you change from a problem to a solution-focused framing. I actually shake my head a lot at modern politics because everyone seems so focused into the how we're going to do things that we lose sight of the fact that we actually agree at the highest level on 70% of the priorities, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. Instead, what do? Everyone focuses on attacking each other's characters and behaviors. And has it made us stronger or weaker as nations? In North America, I would argue weaker. Adapting your communication approach is actually another great tactic to deploy. If you know someone who is more data-driven, for example, provide more data to them. If you know that they're more emotionally driven, speak from the heart. If you can meet people where they are, or at least closer to where they are, your influence and persuasion capabilities will exponentially improve, giving you more control over the outcomes of the conflict management resolution. So let's move on to the second most common source of conflict, and that's different agendas. We just mentioned a tactic of finding common ground or shared goals. In this particular source of conflict, you can't find either, and that's the main reason for the conflict. This is where a lot of senior executives fail, from my experience, because they can't set common ground or shared goals due to a lack of vision and strategy, causing all sorts of operational challenges. I've seen a number of different underlying reasons as the root cause for this source of conflict as well. Let's say you and I have competing priorities that we're being measured on, and only one of us can actually get the priority, right? That's going to cause a conflict, obviously. Misaligned goals is another one I've seen nearly everywhere I've worked. Now, how that looks is that one team has a goal based on speed and another one has a goal based on quality. So one team is saying, whoa, slow down, let's get this right. Well, the other one is saying, no, go faster, just get it done. We don't care about the quality. Again, I'm sure you can see how that's a conflict brewing there. Sometimes a lack of transparency of agendas is a source of conflict. I've seen that one run wild as people make assumptions about each other's agendas, and oftentimes the assumptions lean on the extreme negative side. For example, a case of genuine forgetfulness is assumed to be intentional maliciousness, and that's a common one I've seen. So how can you best navigate this type of conflict? Well, one, I think encouraging opening discussions about agendas and motivations is hugely disarming for everyone. When you openly discuss your agendas, you minimize the potential for misunderstandings too. I've openly discussed my agenda with people and said, this is what I'm looking to get out of it. And I'll even say, I assumed you were looking to get X or Y out of it, but I also wanted to be careful not to assume. So I kept that to myself. And I hope I didn't assume incorrectly. If I did, I apologize. Now, I'm very deliberate in why I frame it that way. I'm framing it that way because I want to call out my assumptions in a way that isn't attacking them. And I'm also trying to discern them simultaneously so they will open up and give me their real agenda. When they reveal their real agenda or their goals, then I look for the shared goals to reframe things around. Another tactic I've used is forcing prioritization discussions. Now, we've talked about this in other episodes. In our Secrets of Managing Up episode, actually, we talked about that, and it applies here as well. Forcing the discussions on prioritization ensures that stakeholders have to align on priorities or receive clear direction from a higher authority. This simultaneously allows you to practice your negotiation skills as well, because there will always be limited time, people, and money to get things done. So learning to negotiate is critical and part of conflict management resolution. We will do an episode dedicated to negotiation and outcomes, probably more than one, at a later time. If you do struggle with these approaches, one that I've seen in a number of environments as well is bringing in an objective third party to facilitate or arbitrate some sort of agreement or discussion. It can be someone from an unaffected team or even someone outside the company, though just a note, if you're going to recommend bringing somebody in, there will be a cost associated with it, typically. Now that brings us to the third main source of conflict, which is different perceptions. The challenging thing about different perceptions is that the facts might not be in dispute. You and I might see the same thing and totally agree on that thing, but the interpretation of the facts or that thing is completely different. That makes this one tricky because you have to align perceptions, which can be very challenging. Those differences in perception occur for a handful of reasons, including a different perception of reality. This difference in perception about reality, I actually think online echo chambers are exacerbating the problem of, because they reinforce a single perception of reality where things are always more complex and nuanced than a single view would push on any side about anything. Perceptions are also formed about our individual biases, assumptions, and experiences. What you and I have been through is going to be very different, so therefore we're going to look at things very differently, even the same things. Dana and I spoke about how perception can be a funny thing in an earlier episode, framing a conversation around the perception of an apple on a table. Now, in the situation, one person had watched a family member choke to death on apple, while the other had a warm feeling from their childhood about eating apples with oatmeal as a kid. So one apple, two people, two very different perceptions looking at the same thing. One sees an instrument of death, the other sees an instrument of nostalgic joy. Now here's the thing to consider about the perception situation. Both can be right. Something can be two or more things all at the same time. So how can you best navigate this type of complex conflict? Well, for starters, share your perspective and encourage others to share theirs so you can better understand where each other is coming from. It's okay to acknowledge that you have different perspectives as well. You can diffuse a situation through that acknowledgement, and conflict resolution doesn't always have to end in agreement. I've seen lots of conflicts that didn't end in agreement, but they still ended in a handshake. Sometimes you agree to disagree, and that's okay too. Another tip that served me well is to try to reframe the conversation to be less of a me versus you and more of a we are both part of a larger system that has to work together for all of our success. This approach is a tactic to reframe things around common goals or outcomes that we talked about earlier. At the very least, you can use it to find a win-win solution. And as we'll talk about in a future episode, a win-win is the best type of negotiation outcome you can achieve. Something else that I've seen work for both me and others is validating the other person's perspective. I don't mean you agree. You're acknowledging, though, or validating their feelings can be enough to diffuse situations as well. And on that note, that covers some general best practices for confidently managing conflict, as well as the three main sources and some recommendations on how best to manage each. I know I threw a lot at you guys today, so let me summarize what I believe are the 5 most important takeaways. Get comfortable with conflict. Mindset shift. Conflict is not failure. It's a catalyst for progress. Focus on shared goals, not personal differences. Start with how can we both succeed instead of who's right. Adapt your approach to different styles. Meet people where they are to build influence and resolve issues faster. Be transparent about agendas and priorities. Always clarify goals early to prevent misunderstandings later. And validate different perspectives without needing to agree. A good phrase to use is, I can see where you're coming from, even if my view is different, to diffuse things. I want to end today trying to shift your perspective on conflict a little as well. Instead of seeing conflict as a bad thing to be avoided, start to look at conflict as telling a story. A story where people care deeply. A story where people see the world differently and stand for what matters to them. When we encounter different agendas, conflicting perspectives, or clashing personal styles, it feels messy and uncomfortable for sure. But those are the moments where ideas are born and leaders are formed. When we lean into our differences with curiosity instead of judgment, when we listen with intent to understand, not to defend, we turn friction into fuel. So the next time you find yourself in the heat of disagreement, pause and remember, conflict isn't something to fear, it's something to steward. And every tough conversation you manage well is helping you manage your mental health, stand up for yourself and your beliefs, and give you more confidence in life. And with that, thank you for spending part of your journey with me today. Appreciate your time. Hopefully you got some value out of that today. And until next time, stay curious, keep leading, and don't forget to like, subscribe, share us with your friends in your network, help get us out there. Thanks, everyone.
This has been the Leadership Gambit podcast with your host, management expert, Chris Miller. If you like our content, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment or review, make a donation, and most importantly, share us with others in your network. Visit us at www.theleadershipmovement.net for more content and helpful business resources.